Hello everyone, this is Anne from the I Thought I Knew How podcast. We are finishing up working with our Fair Isle style swatch cuff to use as a swatch for when we are knitting Fair Isle. This is just a little cuff that you can knit and practice some Fair Isle techniques and take your gauge from, most importantly, before you start on your larger Fair Isle project. I designed this to help us prepare for the Maakin for the MRI knit along that will start on January 1st, 2020. If you'd like to join that, you need to go over to the Purl Together Ravelry group and find the Maakin for the MRI thread. The patterns for the knit along are available at mrimakers.com, and they were created to raise funds for the Shetland MRI scanner appeal to buy an MRI scanner for the people of Shetland. So hop over there and pick up a pattern and get your yarn and get ready to cast on with us on January 1st by knitting up this little cuff to help you take your gauge. So I'm going to be knitting the cowl during the knit along. It's the largest project. It's probably going to take me the entire month to get through it. And the gauge for that project is using a 3.25 millimeter needle. I should get 30 stitches and 32 rows to equal 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and take my measurements now and see what I came up with my swatch cuff. Now, one of the reasons why we have this heart here that alternates between the main color and the contrast color is because it will make it easier for you to count. And even though our gauge is a 4-inch gauge, we are going to measure over 2 and double it. So as we do that, we want to make sure that we are getting an exact count, thinking even about half and quarter size stitches as we measure. So on this ruler, the 0 line is right against that dip there. And I'm going to line that up with the silver stitches over here. And without pushing down, if I push down, that's going to distort the stitches. I'm just going to hold the stitches, the ruler in my right hand, so it's sort of just resting on it, and then I'll use my left hand to count with using the pencil. So this is lined up along the edge there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And then this stitch here is a half stitch. And that is very important because I am taking my gauge over 2 inches. So I'm going to have to double this to get a 4-inch gauge. So that half stitch is going to make a difference. So I have 14.5 stitches, and I'm going to do a little math here. 14.5 stitches, multiply that by 2 so that my 2-inch gauge becomes a 4-inch gauge. And that's going to give me 29 stitches. Now, that is 1 stitch less than the 30 stitches I was hoping to get. What does that mean? Well, the cast on for my cowl is 303 stitches. So if I'm measuring across 30 stitches and I'm aiming for 303 in the proper project, that means that any deviation here is going to be 10 times greater in the final project. So 1 extra stitch, or if my stitch is off by 1, that means that in the final project, it's going to be off by 10. Now in the cowl, that's going to translate into about an inch, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, just about an inch. And in a project that big, that's not really problematic. If I were knitting the hat comes up to 19 inches. And if I ended up having to cast on and ended up with something that was going to give me an inch difference, that would end up with a 20-inch hat in the end. So if I have a 19-inch head and I'm wanting to wear if I have a 19-inch head and I end up with a 20-inch hat, that's going to be baggy on me. But I actually have a 22-inch head, so a 20-inch hat would be perfect for me. So this is all stuff you need to consider when you're thinking about your gauge, because the designer has designed it to fit how she wants it to fit, but we don't all fit that same way. We have different sized hands, different sized heads. So you want to take the time and do the math and think about just how different your gauge is going to be. Now, if that 1 inch difference is going to be problematic for me, because my stitches are big, I would actually next want to try a 3 millimeter needle. I'd want to try a smaller needle to make my stitches smaller, to try and get more of them per inch, to get to that 30 stitches per inch. Now, measuring the row gauge, this swatch only measures about 2¼ inches, and I can't do my gauge over the ribbing because the ribbing gauge is going to be slightly different than the Fair Isle gauge. I want to just take my measurement over the Fair Isle. So I'm actually going to start measuring from this silver stitch here, which is the second contrast color stitch in my heart. And I'm going to hold it again hold the ruler so that it's just resting, and so that my 0 line is right at the bottom of that stitch, and I'm going to measure up to the 1 line. From there, I will multiply this measurement by 4 to get a 4-inch gauge. Okay, so starting here, right at the bottom of that stitch, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 rows times 4 gives me 32 rows, which is spot on. That's amazing. I'm never spot on with my gauge, but my row gauge is right. My stitch gauge is slightly off. Now, what does this mean? Because I got gauge with this, it means the height of my cowl should be very close to the height of Harriet's cowl when I'm done with it. Now, if I ended up with 30 rows instead of 32, what that would mean is that I would need to go to a smaller needle, or I could leave out rows as I'm knitting. Now, that's complicated with the cowl or with the headband. With the cowl and the headband, you're knitting up, you're getting to a turning point, and then you continue knitting. So as you remove anything from if you decide to remove any plain rows from your knitting, you want to make sure you do the same number of rows on either side of that dividing line. Now, Harriet does have several points in her patterns where she says knit 3 rows plain or knit 1 row plain. You can cut that down from 3 rows to 1 row if you like, or from 3 rows to 2 rows. Just make sure that you cut out those extra rows on one side and on the other side if you're doing the cowl or the headband. If you're doing the hat or any of the hand coverings and you need to do a shortening, then you just figure out where you're going to do that in the course of knitting the entire pattern. And again, the best place to do those is when the pattern says knit 2 rows plain, knit 3 rows plain. You can just take out one of those plain rows. Why would you do that? Well, when I knit my hat the very first time, my row gauge was much smaller. I had something like 29 stitches per row, 29 rows per 4 inches. So my hat is about 2 inches, 1.5 to 2 inches too long, which is fine. I can put a pom-pom on the back and it'll look like a slouchier style hat. But if you want it to fit more like a beanie, then you need to, if you end up with a smaller number for your row gauge, you're going to want to take some stitches out. So gauge isn't as clear-cut as some people want it to be, unfortunately, because you have to consider not just what the designer designed, but the final size of what the designer designed and whether that will suit you. If you have larger hands, you might want to aim for smaller gauge numbers. That'll mean that your final project ends up being bigger. If you have tinier hands or you're knitting for someone with tinier hands, then you might want to have number of stitches higher than the gauge so that your final project comes out smaller. Okay, these are all things to consider. And again, if you end up with fewer stitches per inch, then you want to go to a smaller needle. If you end up with more stitches per inch, like 32 or 33, that means your stitches are small. You want to go to a bigger needle, like a 3.5 or 3.75. Okay, so more stitches means your stitches are small, go to a bigger needle. Fewer stitches mean your stitches are big, go to a smaller needle. Okay, I hope this is helpful. I will be in the group, the Purl Together Ravelry group, if you have any questions. I look forward to seeing your projects as we progress through the knit along. So everybody take care. I hope this is helpful. Bye-bye.